Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, The Green Book, A Black History of the American Road Trip, presented by Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes. We're going to be getting started in just a few minutes. Participants are entering from the waiting room right now, so please be patient, and we'll be starting shortly. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program. It's called The Green Book, A Black History of the American Road Trip. Participants are just entering from the waiting room right now, so we're going to give them a little time to get situated, and we'll be getting started shortly. Thanks for your patience. Good evening, everyone. It's just a few minutes past 5 o'clock, and I think participants will be joining us as we're in progress. So we're going to get started, and I'm going to say good evening again, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled The Green Book, A Black History of the American Road Trip, presented by Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. And it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight, we have more than 140 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. And oftentimes we do this with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Membership dues are modest and the benefits are many. We simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our speaker. Program, The Green Book, A Black History of the American Road Trip, is being presented by Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Davis Hayes, well, she is an associate professor of U.S. history at California Baptist University and studies the imaging of race and its impact on popular culture. Her research has taken her around the world, and she's lectured about the politic of American popular culture in universities, including the National University in Rwanda, the Beijing Academy of Social Sciences, and UNAM in Mexico City. She also serves as an alumnus board member of Cal Humanities. That's the state branch of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is the academic in residence for the Women's Empowerment Foundation, which educates women on topics including body image, women's rights, and international women's issues. She is currently working on a book regarding the history of Black women on television during the Civil Rights era. Tonight, Dr. Davis Hayes will be talking about the historic challenges of Black travel and the spaces of leisure that emerged for Black travelers between the 1930s and 1960s. Historically, road tripping stood as a romanticized part of the American experience, though this pastime did not necessarily hold the same allure for African Americans. To compensate, Victor Hugo Green published the Negro Motorist Green Book, which guided Black travelers to safe spaces of rest and relaxation nationwide. Tonight, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the top of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It is always my honor to join the Book Club of California. This is my second time meeting with all of you, and so again, it's my absolute pleasure. As Kevin said, we are speaking this evening about the Green Book, the history of African American travel in the mid-20th century. I find this to be a very personal topic, especially now as we are in the height of a pandemic, and I and my family, interestingly enough, are considering road tripping. And I really do think about the reality of us road tripping in 2021 and the ease. Where do we want to go? Where are we going to stay? But also realizing that my own parents, my grandparents would not have been able to access travel and access the country in the same way that I do today. Most of you most likely became familiar with the concept of the Green Book on a popular level as a result of the movie, which shares the name, The Green Book, which came out a couple of years ago. And this is when we see a rise in a popular interest in the dynamic of Black travel in the mid-20th century. And while that movie could at times be entertaining, I do think that it is fair to say that there were gaps in that film. And so I'm always glad that entities like the Book Club of California are creating platforms for us to be clearer about the reality of Black travel, what those conditions were like, and if we're also honest, what the joys of some of those experiences could be. When we begin looking at the history of Black travel in the nation, I'm always clear that we cannot separate Black travel from a broader automotive culture in American society. Of course, we see the mass production of the automobile in the 1920s, and car culture will sweep American society. We will see a rising middle class, access cars, but not only access cars, but we will see a radical culture shift as a result of this introduction of automobiles into American culture. We will see a nation that is no longer beholden to train schedules. We will see a nation that is no longer beholden to animals, right? If you watch old Westerns, of course, my parents love Westerns, I love Westerns. We are going from a horse and buggy to, as they would have said for some, a horseless carriage. And so there was an absolute excitement and a rage about getting in the car. There was also a fear about Americans getting in the car for the first time and in large numbers. People wondered if communities would fail because of the automobile. Would people drive away and never come home? Would women get into a car and be so enamored with being on the road that they would not come home to their husbands and their children? Some people said that the car was the key to the end of the family and the end of community and stability in American society. Of course, that was not true. Instead, though, we see a connecting of the nation. Instead of a decline of a community, scholars say that the car actually just made American society bigger in terms of how people defined their quote unquote local community. The federal government was very much so aware of the reality of car culture. And so by the time we get to the late 1920s, the building of roads, reliable roads and reliable highways, was the second largest expenditure in the nation. And of course, ads. Ads will be one of the greater records of the rage around cars, the excitement around cars. And car companies made sure that people saw automobiles as safe, but also they were clear that automobiles were the key to American freedom. Here we have on the far left a woman, and a lot of these car ads did gear towards families, as I said. Quote, I always feel safe when I start out with the children in my Buick. So you have young families who are able to find freedom, but not in the name of a decaying family structure, people would say, but also people finding freedom altogether, the birth of the road trip. On the right, we see the Ford touring car taking off, and the idea that you can have 5 people in your car to go and see the nation. And then in the middle, some of these cars are so easy to drive that, quote, woman driver amazes Seattle crowd. And so automotive culture will end up taking over American society, and Americans will indeed hit the road. And they will hit the road to new highways. They will hit the road to gas stations, as well as hotels and motor courts, some communities would call them. We also see, sort of as a sidebar, that with the access to the automobile, we see access as well to medical care as well as education. People will be healthier as a result of the car, and people will be better educated as a result of the car. By 1925, Route 66 was established, linking Chicago and Los Angeles, meaning that the nation is linked and the car is dominating that dynamic of the linking of communities. We also see with the introduction of car culture and the rise of hotels that this is no longer something that just well-off people are able to access. Historically, well-off people would likely see more parts of the country than more middle-class people, or of course, even working-class people. And also there's no stigma, that no matter who you are, you can go and check into a hotel and stay there without a certain amount of moral judgment, which in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century could be very, very common if you weren't staying in the quote unquote better places. So we see all of these social changes in American society. But what we often overlook is that as we see the rise of a car culture in a broader American society, the Black community is always in step with these cultural changes. And the car begins to mean a great deal to the Black community. At the turn of the 20th century, if you look at the top middle photo, we see a Black family that is participating in the Great Migration. Black families and even Black individuals at the turn of the 20th century and the early 20th century during World War I will begin to move out of the South. And yes, many of them will do that via train, but a lot of them will actually pack up their cars post World War I, and they will drive out of the South. Cars will be a testament of their introduction, not simply into the middle class, but into the upper middle class. If you look at this image at the bottom, this is a very well-off and elegant Black family in a northern urban space. And you can see the father has his car, and they're well off enough that even his son has his own version of this automobile. Black youth will use the car to seek out leisure, of course. And of course, families will just take pride in their car. My own grandfather, who lived outside of Washington, D.C., my grandparents, purchased a car every couple of years. He was invested in that car. This would have been the 50s and 60s and on. He shined the car. He was clear that the kids had to not eat in the car, not sully the car in any way. That was on top of the home that he owned, which was a major feat for him. His car was proof that even amidst Jim Crow, he was doing very well in American society. And so the car becomes integral within the American experience. And it is a reflection that African Americans are a part of this American experience, and that many of them are moving into the middle class. Scholars also found as early as the 1940s that the automobile was also used, excuse the pun, as a vehicle of protest. Gunnar Myrdal, who will go on to publish what is known as the American Dilemma, he was Scandinavian. He came into the US as a sociologist to study the quote unquote race problem during the 1940s. And he will write this exhaustive study about what it meant to be Black in American society. And of all of the things that he wrote, his text is rather long. He said, quote, "The coming of the cheap automobile has meant for Southern Negroes who can afford one a partial emancipation from Jim Crowism." And he was clear about this reality of partial. When we think about the segregated experience, and I'm actually really glad that we're looking at car culture and Jim Crowism, I think that for most, when we think about defiance against Jim Crow, we think about Rosa Parks, right? Rosa Parks sits down on a public bus and refuses to give up her seat. Most working class African Americans tended to have to use public transit. And it is this moment on public transit that Black people found themselves so often humiliated as a result of Jim Crow. If you were in the Deep South, you might have to give up your seat to other white passengers. If you were actually traveling across the nation from north to south, buses and trains at times would stop at the Mason-Dixon line. You would have to get up and go into the colored only section. There were trains that would have curtains that would divide Black and white riders. And so Gunnar Myrdal is clear that with the introduction of the car, that was one tiny moment in which Black people could be in transit and avoid a tiny amount of humiliation as a result of segregation and Jim Crowism. And the Black community will flock as much as they can to the purchase of cars. In 1958, Ebony magazine published that 20% of all Black families sought to buy a new car every year. And part of that was in order to feel safe. Though at times, we have to be honest, not all that safe, right? We still have Black drivers being pulled over in many areas for speeding. There were NAACP records saying that some police targeted Black drivers that were going as little as 1 mile over the speed limit. And so once that car stopped, it could still be very dicey for African-American drivers at the height of Jim Crow, and some would argue still to this day. But it was, as Gunnar Myrdal says, a partial emancipation from Jim Crowism. As long as the car was moving, Black people felt that they were safer than they would be if they were participating in public transit or utilizing public transit. But when we look at the Green Book and the ultimate efforts of Victor Hugo Green, what is really interesting about that dynamic is what happens when that car stops. So while we have African-American families that are in the middle class that are desiring, like the rest of the nation, to see the nation, there is, from the 1920s on, road tripping is integral to the American experience, that the nation expands quite far. There's a diversity of terrain. Do you want to see the mountains? Do you want to see the prairie? Do you want to take your family to the ocean for the first time? And to be Black, that was a very difficult decision to make, to put one's family in the car and to go somewhere. And this was as a result of segregated facilities and also a dynamic known as sundown towns, which I will explain. Again, Gunnar Myrdal says that this was a partial relief from Jim Crowism. Scholars and even members of the Black press that interviewed those who would road trip asked about what were some of the links that they went through to feel prepared in this trip. Many families said that when they, as Black people, went on road trips or felt the need to drive far, that they would have in their car buckets, because a lot of gas stations and restaurants would not allow them to use the bathroom. And if they did, the bathrooms were intentionally so poorly cared for that they were not usable. That families would pack days worth of food because it was quite common that restaurants would not serve Black riders. And I'm always reminding my own students when I'm teaching in the classroom setting that this is not merely a Southern dynamic. Under Jim Crow, the entire nation is segregated. So it's not like you're a Black driver in 1955 and you stop in Denver, Colorado, and you can access any restaurant that you want to, or you're driving through West Texas or Southern California. There were even instances in which families would put into their glove compartments chauffeur hats. And if they were stopped, that they would tell the police that, oh, this is not my car. Of course, I would never be able to afford a car such as this. I am driving this car for my white employer who wants me to transfer his or her car from one place to another. I have a very personal story about that, as my grandmother was a part of the domestic household staff of a very wealthy industrialist in North Carolina. And they had their huge mansion in North Carolina, but then they also had another estate in upstate New York. And so once a year, they would inform the household staff that it was time for them to summer, right? The wealthy families summer, even to this day. And they would pack up the house, and the things that they wanted, specifically as personal items, would be sent to New York. But then also their fleet of cars would also be sent to New York. And that is how the household staff, which is exclusively African American, would get to this other estate. And they would have paperwork from the head of the family saying that these beautiful cars belonged to him and that they were members of his staff and that they needed a pass through a lot of these both Southern and Northern communities that would question Black drivers in a nice car. And so we see people realizing that it could be dangerous to be Black behind the wheel at the height of Jim Crow, that they would create these imaginary white employers in order to feel safer. But of course, like I said, there's also just basic segregated facilities, which I discussed, and also sundown towns. And for those of you who are not familiar with sundown towns, which were prolific across the West and the North, were towns that had built into their charter that they did not allow African Americans to be within their city or town limits after dark. And if you were within those town limits, you were breaking the law and you would be arrested. Some people would also argue that you would be tracked by some sort of white supremacist organization, you would be beaten, harassed, or worse, killed. And so this was the reality of African Americans who were driving across the nation, and not simply across the South, but nationally, not always knowing what was going to greet them, not even knowing if it was legal for them to be in those spaces. A gentleman by the name of Lester Grange, the executive secretary of the Urban League in 1947, commented, quote, "So far as travel is concerned, Negroes are America's last pioneers, meaning that they were in the frontier, that they were constantly meeting danger and question as they were on the open road, as predominantly white Americans had gone road tripping since the 1920s and were defining their freedom by that ability to do so. In 1950, the Negro Digest claimed, quote, "Black travelers gained admittance to all but the cheapest of restaurants and the most flea-bitten of hotels. Travel for Negroes inside the United States can become an experience so fraught with humiliation and unpleasantness that most colored people simply never think of a vacation in the same terms as the rest of America." I remember asking my mother, probably shortly after I did a similar presentation to this one, about my grandfather, who I mentioned, because he lived in a small town by the name of Frederick, Maryland, which is probably about 30 miles outside of Washington, D.C., but he worked in Washington, D.C. proper. And I began to think about, this was a man who was a commuter, a rather extensive commuter, I would say, 30 miles in the 1950s and 60s. And I asked her about that process, whether the family worried about him. And she said yes and no, in that he lived during the week in Washington, D.C. with family, so he wouldn't have to commute for his own safety. My grandmother would pack him all sorts of food just in case, so he would never have to sort of stop. He would make sure his gas tank was filled. But when he did come home on the weekends to stay with his wife and children, she said that he would wait until it was dark and he would drive at night, and that it was a little easier because he felt that the police would not always be able to see him as a Black man in the dark. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what people look like in the dark when they're driving. And so it is fascinating that, okay, I'm going to go out of my way to care for my family, but I'm going to make sure that his car was always in mint condition in terms of working order. You did not want to be broken down as a Black man. And it was just, like I said, above and beyond the expectations of your everyday, quote unquote, white American driver, that he had to think about these things as a Black motorist at the height of Jim Crow. But this brings me to the Green Book itself, in which a gentleman on the far left by the name of Victor Hugo Green founds this travel guide for Black travelers. There's a lot of variation in terms of the story behind the founding of the Green Book. What we do know is that Victor Hugo Green was a postal worker. He lived in New York City, but he delivered mail in New Jersey. Some people say that Victor Hugo Green took cues from the travel guides that were published for Jewish American travelers, because resorts and hotels, sometimes even restaurants, could be so very anti-Semitic and discriminatory against Jewish patrons. And so Jewish Americans had created spaces for themselves to travel and to resort and to vacation in a way that they would not have to face discrimination as a rising and up and coming Jewish American community. So some say that he took that as a cue to create a book for the Black community. Others say that living in Harlem, that he knew numbers of Black musicians in his community, which is also very possible. Both can be true at the same time, and we have to be honest about that. And that his neighbors who were traveling musicians talked often about having to go to various cities, go to various venues to perform, and that they struggled to find places to stay, that they struggled to find places to eat, and that was his inspiration. But either way, whichever is true, either or both, we do know that the Green Book ran from 1936 to 1966. It started out just covering the New York City metro area, but as a result of an ongoing demand we see the Green Book expanding not just nationwide, but by the time we hit the 1960s, it is an international travel guide for African American travelers. It initially cost 25 cents, but by its height in the 1950s and 60s, it cost about $1.25 in order to purchase. And it was the go-to for Black travelers to find safe, clean, and fun places to visit. With the Negro Green Book, we actually see Black people finally beginning to have a sliver of the travel experience that white Americans had enjoyed since the 1920s. We see the rise of Black hotels, and I'm going to go into details of some of these, as well as all Black resorts. What was also a turning point for the Green Book is the fact that most gas stations would not sell the Green Book because they would not sell gasoline to Black motorists, if you can imagine. Standard Oil was the first gas station nationwide through Esso. Standard Oil was the first oil company to sell through its gas station, Esso, the Green Book. And this was a way for African Americans also to be able to know that if it was an Esso station, that they would be able to purchase gasoline. And we began to see more and more as we get into the 40s and into the 50s, Black motorists feeling comfortable to do that. So we have hotels, and I found a couple of images for you that came out of this Green Book dynamic. So we have the Biltmore Hotel in Durham, North Carolina. There it is on the left. It was billed as America's finest colored hotel. I found a small ad, and it said all outside rooms, meaning that you would be able to access the hallway and not some other room or what have you. All outside rooms, running hot and cold water in each room. The last word in comfort. Do it the Biltmore way. We have on the far right the Powell Hotel in Dallas, Texas. The Powell Hotel will be an ongoing stop for Black luminaries like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Joe Louis. And finally, in Idlewild, Michigan, we have, and this actually predates the Green Book, but the Green Book will feature it, and we'll see an uptick in African Americans using the space. In Idlewild, Michigan, we have a Black resort. And initially it was founded by Black elite and founded by and for the Black elite at the turn of the 20th century. Investors like W.E.B. Du Bois, Madam C.J. Walker, and the author Charles Chesnutt got together to have their own sort of frou-frou resort. But as time went on, it became less sort of invitation only and snooty. And instead, it became a resort that drew members of the Black middle class throughout the 40s and 50s. And as you can see, these women in the middle are absolutely gorgeous. I don't care what era it is. This blonde woman looks fantastic. Bathing suits are all on point. And so we see African Americans finding these hotels and finding cities that will have Black hotels that will welcome them. And now they can resort. Now they can hotel. They're getting a tiny piece of the American travel experience that a lot of the Black community had been hoping for quite some time. But for those who are simply road tripping, going from one place to another for business reasons, to visit family, or simply because they want to see the nation, sometimes Black hotels and resorts are not on their flight path. And so what Victor Hugo Green does in his Green Book is not only does he feature hotels and resorts, but also private homes. These are known as tourist homes, and they were tourist homes, they were private residence for tourists registered by Black families. What is amazing is that a lot of these tourist homes were in smaller towns, they were in rural communities, but they were vetted by the Green Book for their cleanliness, for their safety. And also, the Green Book always wanted to make sure that these spaces were, again, respectable. If you look closely on the left under, oh my gosh, Arkadelphia, Arkansas, you see Mrs. B. Deadman Tourist Home. Now, there is a small hotel, Hills Hotel, and also Black travelers would have only been able to eat in that one restaurant in Arkadelphia. But a lot of the tourist homes have Mrs. And the idea is that Black travelers would feel more comfortable to call upon a married lady who is accustomed, this is, a very mid 20th century idea, who is accustomed to keeping house. And the fact that it was a woman's home made it more respectable and the idea also more comfortable for travelers. If a woman's name, and of course there are exceptions and I can see that, if it was not a woman's name, sometimes it would be the home of a local respected person, a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer. So if you go down to El Dorado, Arkansas on the left, Dr. Dunning. So if a family, the family head of the household had some sort of esteemed degree that kind of outranked the Mrs. It's all very interesting. And families or travelers would say, oh, who am I going to stay with? Mrs. fill in the blank, or am I going to stay with Dr. fill in the blank? One of the things that stuck out to me when I watched the Green Book in terms of the motion picture is that I felt that the spaces that they stayed in terms of the hotels, were kind of run down. Whereas historians who look at the reality of the Green Book experience found that these houses tended to be, and even hotels tended to be immaculate. People went out of their way because there was a stigma that African Americans, and not just African Americans, but all minorities were dirty in some way, were inferior in some way. And so people tried to keep their properties up if they were going to be a part of this Green Book system. There was also, I was asking my mother if she knew anyone in her city, her town of Frederick, who had a lodging in the Green Book. And I found an old version, and she saw one of her neighbors that she remembered from a child. And she said, we always wondered why her house, as children, why her house was so spotless. And this woman was always washing windows and sweeping her porch, and to be invited into her home was a big event because the furniture was so nice and everything was always in its place. And then for my mother to be an adult so many years later and see that this woman was in the Green Book, Mrs. So-and-so was in the Green Book. She's like, oh, that makes sense now. And so I always thought that was really interesting. So when one would call a private home and say you were going to arrive or just call upon, these people were always prepared. They took this very seriously. As you all are a part of the Book Club of California, we cannot overlook the role of the Green Book in the American West. And again, the West and the American North was not at all exempt from this Jim Crow experience. And so there were numbers of entries for the Green Book in the American West because the West as well could be highly and very deeply discriminatory. According to Green Book scholar Candace Taylor, the 1930 census listed 44 of 89 counties along Route 66 headed west as sundown towns. And so some people would say that the West was even trickier for Black motorists and travelers than even the South, because at least you knew in the South that it was discriminatory and in what way. Whereas in the West, it was always an implied sort of discrimination and people could find themselves in strange positions. Scholars found that before the 1920s, there were quote, no hotels for Black travelers, none at all. And so with the rise of the Green Book, as well as the rise of a Black community in the West as well as a result of the Great Migration, we see the founding of Black hotels and Black resorts across the West. And being in California, I chose two examples. The first on the left is the Dunbar Hotel. The Dunbar Hotel was off of Central Avenue in Los Angeles. And this was the heart of the jazz scene in Los Angeles. And interestingly enough, the Hotel Douglas in San Diego will have a similar role as well. But the Dunbar Hotel was a space in which Black movie stars, Black musicians would be able to come together to stay in the hotel. If you read about people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, very often they would perform in venues that they were not allowed to eat, that they were not allowed to stay. So this was a moment for Black luminaries to stay in a hotel that was beautiful, to be served in a hotel with top-notch service, and to just sort of rub elbows with the elite. Now, I did read, and this is a sidebar, that the Dunbar Hotel at some point was integrated, and that was sort of the joke. The integration was that W.C. Fields came to the Dunbar Hotel to hear a friend play a concert, and he got so very drunk that he passed out and fell asleep in the lobby. Nobody woke him up, and so that people sort of smiled to themselves like, well, I guess the Dunbar is officially an integrated hotel, as we did care for a white patron overnight, which people always thought was quite funny. But that was the heart of Black luxury stay, a Black luxury stay in Los Angeles. And then the Dunbar Hotel had a similar sort of, let's say, sister hotel in San Diego, and that was the Hotel Douglas. And the Hotel Douglas even billed itself as the Harlem of the West. And that would be the center of the jazz scene in San Diego, in which people like Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Josephine Baker were all seen to be a part of this Hotel Douglas crowd and go to visit. When we look at Black travel in the West, though, it's not simply the rise of hotels in major cities up and down the West Coast, but we also have the birth, because if one is going to go west, you probably should have a solid dude ranch experience. We see in the 1930s and 40s the founding of Murray's Dude Ranch. And those are the Murrays right there. That's Noli and Leela Murray. They started out with this ranch. It's a very sweet story, wanting to have a space for at-risk youth. And so started out with a lot of young boys on their ranch, and they had horses and they had cattle, and they were teaching these young men how to be responsible and to care for themselves. But over time, this particular ranch began to morph into a space where African Americans would have the full Western experience. And it was popularized when the boxer Joe Louis came and took a number of pictures, and the Black community just sort of went nuts for having a dude ranch experience. The Murray's Dude Ranch is also a space in which a number of Black Westerns are filmed. And so it becomes integral to the Black Hollywood elite to get away from the demands of Hollywood at the height of Jim Crow. People like Hattie McDaniel would go and have a respite in Murray's Dude Ranch for vacation. And Murray's Dude Ranch will continue on after the Murrays themselves retire from overseeing the Dude Ranch. Pearl Bailey will purchase the Dude Ranch and oversee it. She'll also renovate it and update it. She'll bring in telephone lines and hot water and things like that. And this will be sort of the capital of the all Black, just about Wild West experience. Though some people say that Clark Gable spent a lot of time at Murray's Dude Ranch. Some people also whisper that Clark Gable may have been passing, but that's a whole different conversation. Dun, dun, dun. And so the Green Book becomes such a key part to the Black experience, the Black traveler experience within American society. And one of the things that's amazing about Victor Hugo Green is that he had no desire for the Green Book to always be a part of American life. This was a project that he founded and he launched. There were millions of Green Books in circulation over its 30-year run. But his hope was that one day the Green Book would fade away when it was no longer needed and American society had become more equitable. And he wrote himself, quote, "There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. This is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please." And indeed, the Green Book did have its publication suspended shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act under the Johnson administration. And that was the Green Book. Thank you so very much.
Well, I'm just jumping right in here because I know we have some great questions in the chat and the Q&A. And I first just want to say thank you so much for such a terrific presentation. And I've seen it twice now. And I think I've learned more this second time than I did the first time. And I love how you really made the connection, at least for me, between the whole idea of the car culture to Jim Crowism and how they are so connected, and the car being used for things like protection and safety in some instances, and for rebellion, right, to get out and actually live lives, independence, and ultimately for emancipation, some form of emancipation. I think that was so it's so interesting, and for me that was the real takeaway, the real connection this time. Last time I heard this, you speak about the Green Book, I was really focused more on the spaces of leisure, the places that people went to, and the things that were kind of advertised or featured in the Green Book, which are interesting as well. And I think there are some questions about that. So we're gonna jump right into some of these great questions and see if you can elaborate, I think, a little bit more. The first one has to do with some of the distribution of the Green Book. And you mentioned that it could be found at gas stations. Where else would somebody find it and buy it?
Quite often one could write in. So there was a Green Book office, and you would know where that office is in Black magazines, right? And so you would write in, and then they would mail it back to your house. You would send in your money, and it would be, and they would mail it back, like so many things in the mid 20th century.
Right.
So it was easily accessed. One didn't have to go to a gas station. And what scholars found is that a lot of Black travelers decided that they had to be prepared. So this wasn't something that they're already necessarily on the road. And they say to themselves, oh my goodness, I need a Green Book. They would have had a Green Book sent to them before they even left. Now, if I understand correctly, with the gas station, sometimes the gas stations had updated versions. This was a text that was constantly being updated. And so if you already have one, maybe that you had ordered, and then maybe it was just a couple of years old, then you might stop and buy a new one to see if there's additional tourist homes. And something else that I'm meant to share in this Green Book is it wasn't just restaurants, tourist homes, and hotels. It was also barbershops. I was amazed. Gas stations, nail salons, mortuaries. The reality of sometimes people traveling and dying on the road and having no idea of who was going to care for their loved ones. There were doctors' offices, dentist offices. It was deep and wide. And so people would update if they went traveling, like, oh, mine is 5 years old or so. And that's where the gas stations came in, but they would have ordered these books.
So it was used in their planning of their trip, not reactive on the road, which makes perfect sense. People do that now, right? You do your research before you go on a trip. So it makes sense that would be the way they would use the Green Book as well. So since you mentioned there were all these other kind of services and vendors listed in the Green Book, can you tell us about kind of the research? Like, how did people get in the Green Book in the first place? Right?
Yes, people would write into Victor Hugo Green's office. So I guess it would be the equivalent to taking out an ad, but it wasn't an ad. It was just the
A listing,
blurb.
right.
Right. And so people would write and say, I am a respectable home in this corner of the nation. I'm willing to open up my home to this. And they would request to be listed.
Mm.
And that's how that typically worked.
And who did some of the vetting? Because you said these were like vetted facilities and homes, like people could write in and say, I want to be listed.
Yes. I would say the tourists themselves. I mean, from what I read, there are records of the office that published this of people saying, I went to Mrs. So-and-so's home and actually was not very tidy, FYI. So I guess it's, it's sort of like Expedia or what is it, TripAdvisor today, like get a poor review. It's not the same, but if there were enough responses from the people saying, I don't know, it's kind of dodgy down there, you might a phone call. But I think that also we do have to be honest that if there are no other options, I'm just projecting, I'm sure the Green Book would be like, look, we're looking at the map. There's nobody else here. And if you don't like Mrs. Jones's biscuits or what have you, you might just have to deal with it because there's nobody else out there in that stretch.
Right.
But yes, tourists could be very, very candid about their experiences to the people who publish the text.
So, I had a question about, because I love the whole tourist homes thing, and it's kind of the rise of like bed and breakfasts in a way.
Sure.
Specialty bed and breakfast. So you said they were registered by Black families. So Black families would write in and say, hey, I want to do this. So were there any risks to them to do that, to get themselves listed, to be in a book that, white supremacist organizations could pick up and go, look, these are the people? Like, did you come across any of that kind of?
I never ran across that. That's a really interesting question. I would say overall, no, because the Green Book was such a text for the Black community. I think that when it got dicey is when some of these tourist homes, likely in the Deep South, were caring for civil rights activists. And that's when you begin to see maybe not so much a connection to the Green Book so much, but you see families that will host people who go south to do voter registration, people who go south for Freedom Summer or to participate in the Freedom Rides or what have you, that some of these families that are keeping them, housing them, feeding them, are risking their lives. And so you find in terms of the writings of civil rights activists saying that sometimes they have to jump around a great deal because they don't want to put these families that are hosting them in danger. Or some of these families saying, no, you're going to stay here. We support you in what you do. We're going to care for you. And I think just recently I was reading something else, and a woman was writing about how her hosts, who she was staying with and, paying, that her husband would just sit up at night on the step and say, as long as you're here, I'm going to keep a watch out because I don't want anything to happen to you as our guest. So I think that would be the turning point for some of these Green Book homes of whether they were caring for activists at the height of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, that makes sense. So people got listed. Were there were display ads in the Green Book, or was everything a listing?
In terms of tourist homes, it would have been listed. In terms of hotels, there would have been ads. So you would have had pictures and things like that.
So they would have paid, the people who have ads with businesses would have paid, and the people who were listed wouldn't have to pay necessarily. They could just be listed because they're volunteering, right?
Right.
Yeah, there's a couple questions about how did that work, right? There are a couple of folks who asked very similar question about the page where you did show the listings of the hotels and the restaurants. And
should I go back?
No, you don't need to go back. It had to do with the Yosemite listings. And you had some very, popular hotels and lodges in Yosemite. And the question was like, was it just easier because it was the national parks, right? Where the Yosemite Lodge was listed, was it national policy? Like, how were those hotels listed?
I think because they were, I don't have a lot of intel about the relationship between race and national parks. We have to say that outside of the South, where Jim Crow is not the law, people could break away from that.
Right.
It's just as Black travelers, you did not know who that was. So yes, there were a handful of integrated spaces, and I would argue that spaces like around, Yosemite, that there was definitely a possibility. But outside of those spaces, accessing lodging could be a lot harder.
Mhm.
And so again, the idea was being prepared. If you get to a space, like a national park, and it is, and I've never read that, Black people were barred from national parks or spaces in those tiny spaces. But once you leave that, and then the question is, how far away from those dynamics is considered leaving that, right?
Mm.
And that's where the Green Book, so the Green Book, like, no, you can go to these spaces very, very close to a national park setting, but you go just a few miles sort of down the road, let us say, and things might change very quickly and very easily.
Right.
So there might have been spaces in the West that were open. And I think another thing that Black travelers often wrote about is that they would be accepted in a space. And then at some point they would be like, oh, well, we know that you're happy here and you're settled, but we've had other patrons complain. And so we're going to have to ask you to leave. And that would be another issue, that you're already there and you may have paid already, but because other white travelers just don't want Black travelers in their orbit, then they would have to pack up and go somewhere. And so sometimes spaces on the face could be integrated until there was a complaint, and then Black travelers could be pushed out.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. We're along the same lines of, like, I know you don't have a lot of intel on the national parks.
I know. I can look that up though.
That's okay. It's because it's interesting that they were listed
really,
on that page, and maybe there are other parks in other pages, in the Green Book. Because there was a question about what were the challenges that the publisher had to get the book published. Were there, organized efforts to shut it down, to, keep it out of people's hands, or did it just kind of happen?
No, not at all. It was initially supported. There was a Negro wing of the American Bureau of Tourism. Oof. And so they were the first to sort of invest in this Green Book. And then, of course, you begin to have people who are paying for it, right? So he had on the ground investors. There was a support from tourism organizations that were very honest that Black people do travel. So it's not a bad investment. And then you have communities, and we have to remember that it started out just in New York. And so he'll get a certain amount of revenue, and then he'll reinvest that as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right.
And so that's sort of where that comes from.
Right. So that speaks a little bit to the financial model for the publishing of the Green Book and how that actually happened, which makes sense. So we're almost at the top of the hour, but there's a couple of other questions in here I'm going to try to get in. This is kind of an interesting question. Is there any sort of Green Book today for Black travelers?
There is, in terms, and maybe not a book so much, we're in the digital age. So there are hosts of Black travel Instagram pages and Twitter feeds, and that's all that people do. And I follow some of them just because I'm fascinated. And some of these pages now, the newest thing, especially after the Black Lives Matter protests and people are encouraged to buy Black and support Black businesses, is that there are Instagram pages that look at Black-owned resorts and hotels across the nation, as well as all over the world. So there is a rise of a couple of Black-owned hotels in Mexico, on the eastern side, there'll be the Caribbean side, and there's a lot of buzz about that. So I would say yes, and there are also numbers of Black travel clubs that people join, and so you don't have to know people, but if you just feel more comfortable for your traveling companions to be from the Black community, people sign up for that today. So I would definitely say that is the modern Green Book.
Yeah.
To go to these hotels, to go to Black-owned resorts, to travel with other Black travelers internationally. So yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. There are still resources. It just might be a printed pamphlet that you order. You can find out online. I thought it was also, there's a ton of questions on here that I'm going to send you afterwards, and we can talk
Please.
about some of them, and maybe you can get me some answers, and I can get back to the members and attendees who ask them, or if you want to contact them directly, you can do that. Because I want to wrap up with a couple of things. First of all, there's another comment in here where somebody also, like me, wants to thank you for sharing your personal stories that you intertwined with this shocking and sad history lesson, right? That you imparted on us today, because I think that makes it so much more real for me and for everyone else when you bring in that personal component to see how it's impacted you and how racism still exists today, right? I'm reminded driving while Black was a thing, right? You talked about it in this whole car culture was a thing, and it's still a thing today, right? It is the harassment and the arrest that happens still continues, and we see some of the origins of it here with the car culture and the need for the Green Book. So thank you for sharing that with us. I will say that I really love the story about the Dude Ranch. And that is so fascinating. And I think that's a talk all unto itself, right? with Pearl Bailey taking it over and modernizing it. That could be another Book Club of California, very interesting talk that we should talk about. So
I agree. I love the Dude Ranch too, an all Black Dude Ranch, and then all these Black Westerns. And that was just this huge thing at some point.
yeah, that's huge. The whole it's so interesting. Last week we had a talk a lot about Black spaces of leisure and how they came about, mostly in California, Southern California. So that's just another kind of example of one of those incredible spaces and the stories behind it. So again, I'm going to send you all these questions. You can get some answers back to me and maybe connect you with some of these terrific attendees. There's so many interesting questions about the Green Book, the illustrations you showed us from the covers. And, and it appears that it looks like there were some whites on the covers of those. I didn't really notice.
They were not. They were very fair. We have to remember that this is a time of top of racism. It was colorism. So the most attractive of African Americans would have been as light as they could possibly be. And some of them, it would have been able to maybe even pass in today's sort of consciousness. So no, none of those people would have been white. They just would have been like, this is us. We are very fair skinned.
Well, I got that extra question in there where I wasn't expecting to get that in.
They're not. I'm looking at this image. These are not white people.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening about the Green Book. I really loved having you here. And
thank you.
And I want to thank everyone who attended tonight's presentation. Thank you for attending a Book Club of California live online program. Please join us for our next live online program. It's titled A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler. And that's going to be 1 week from tonight, Monday, February 22nd, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. This is going to be a live conversation this time, not just a presentation, but a conversation between writer, artist, and independent literary consultant Louise Steinman and journalist, essayist, and author of the book, Linnell George. So that's 1 week from tonight. And you can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the Book Club of California. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for speaking to us this evening. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Be well and take care. Thank you.